Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, March 30th, 2017. Hello again, everyone. I'm ARIEL HELWANI, back inside our New York City studio. Also back, it is the A-Team. Good to have them here. That's Luke Thomas, spreading love the Brooklyn way of SiriusXM and MMA.
I should have worn it closer to March 9th.
Yes, you should have.
But I got it in March.
Rapper of all time.
Died on March 9th. There we go. Thank you, Cannabis.
Very nice. It's kind of a mix between your love of all things Biggie Smalls and your love of the Knicks.
Yeah, who just clinched a playoff spot. Oh, wait. They clinched a non-playoff spot.
The man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com, is also here.
The lottery, baby.
That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim, Mr. Reliable himself of the Washington Post. Okay, guys, how about this? Breaking news. 2 weeks in a row, we are leading off with a little thing I like to call Bellator MMA.
Oh, my
How
goodness.
about that?
How did we get here?
The times, they are changing. Okay, so last week, we talked a lot about their return to pay-per-view. And at the time, we said multiple times, we only know 2 fights on the card. Well, since then, we know a lot more. We know about the 2 fights, Wanderlei Silva versus Chael Sonnen, main event, Fedor Emelianenko versus Matt Mitrione, co-main event. We also know about 2 title fights, Douglas Lima versus Lorenz Larkin, Michael Chandler versus Brent Primus. We also know about Aaron Pico fighting on the card against the dreaded TBA, and James Gallagher against Shinzo Machida. That's the card as we know it right now. So, a week later, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, a little bit better. I think a little bit better about it. You know, having a chance to get some questions answered from Coker. One of the ones I raised last week was, why didn't you do it with Kimbo? And his answer was basically, Kimbo, I think, was more, this is Coker speaking, was more of a TV star, and maybe the company wasn't ready back then in its transition stage in 2015. So, okay, fair enough. He said that they were maybe going to announce the 5th fight this week. I'm very curious about that. I think Machida versus Gallagher is genius matchmaking. I really like it a lot. And look, I don't know what kind of number it's going to do on pay-per-view, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that Spike came out, and Viacom essentially came out and said, it's not a one-time deal, folks. We're going to do as many of these as we, not as we can, but as many that organically in their minds make sense. You know what's really interesting about Bellator? I want to get this out because I think it should color the discussion a little bit. You know, some of the Bellator staff complained to me after the fact that we were a little hard on them last week.
Come on.
What's up, y'all? Y'all are some sensitive little butterflies. But basically, one thing I did pick up on at this presser, I don't know if you picked up on it too, there is a real self-belief at Bellator right now. Like, everyone who's working there likes what the company is doing, loves the prospect for the future. There's an energy about them, which is why I think they didn't receive some of our criticism all that well. And it's just kind of interesting. Like, I don't know how it's going to do, but they're pumped, man. They really believe in it. They're excited about it. They're excited about the future. And at least internally, that's coloring the image they're presenting to the world.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying right there. I do feel like there's a nice spring air to them, which is a complete difference. I know you mentioned this a little bit to Coker when he was on your show. You know, you go back last year at this time, that's the Kimbo sliced out a 5,000 matchup, and how nearly tragic it was. I mean, it was right there at the border of tragedy on national TV.
Rock bottom, right?
Yeah, and that was rock bottom. And it was weird. Even then, I felt like around that fight, not necessarily that night, but around that fight, I thought they were already in the process of improving the feeling of what was going on over there. And so that just set them back. But I feel like now we've arrived at this spot where, it does feel better. You mentioned media, like they're a darling, they're a little bit of a darling. I do feel like that a little bit. I feel like people are rooting for them a little bit. They are certainly presenting themselves as a place for other, the fighters that want a better deal to have somewhere to go. The fighters that are signing over there, it seems like they're very ecstatic to talk about Bellator. When some of the prospects, they talk about the contract situation, some of the archaic things they're trying to fix. All those things, the sponsorship thing, they love that, et cetera, et cetera. Now, getting back to the whole pay-per-view, though, I do like the Larkin. I love the Larkin-Lima fight. Like, when they made that, I thought, well, that's really good. I guess what I'm still waiting on, but it doesn't sound like it's forthcoming, is that weird hook that we talked about last week.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be something crazy, but I was waiting for that weird thing to be plugged in there that still hasn't come, and it doesn't sound like it's going to come. I think he mentioned, is Scott Coker on your show, that what you're seeing is what you get. So I don't really anticipate there being some 5th attraction that's going to, like, boost it all. I think they're just going to sell us this card.
But there will be a 5th fight.
There will be a 5th fight, but I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the left field thing. That's a little disappointing. I was hoping for something like that. But otherwise, I feel like the 2 fights they added, I'm okay with. I'm behind this fight.
I think when we were talking about this last week, and we were we were talking about that idea of having some big, crazy, out of left field kind of fight to kind of really boost the pay-per-view sales. I think we still were thinking in terms of this being the Bellator big splash, that they don't do pay-per-views very often. They've only done one before. Now here comes number 2, and they've got to really make a splash. But it sounds like, from what we learned at the presser the other day, that they're going to be doing these ongoing. So instead of creating a splash, it sounds like they are willing to just create a ripple and have this ripple out farther into the future, and this be part of their business model. So, good for them. They're creating maybe not big splashes, but the fights they've added since what we talked about last week are good fights. I don't know that they're going to sell a ton of pay-per-views, but it sounds like they're setting things up from the bottom up instead of creating some kind of crazy carnival that is going to make them one splash and then we just move on. So that's not a bad thing.
Coker was always at Strikeforce was, hey, we make fights for TV.
Yeah.
This is a TV model. This is TV fights. That's what we do. And when he came to Bellator, he said something, a very similar script. You remember that 2014 presser? It's the phone call anyway. It sounded very identical. I think what he's trying to do now, and what the company's trying to do now, is they want to reintroduce Bellator to the fans. It took them a while to get their feet. It took a while for free agency to move in their direction. But here they are. They're ready to say, okay, this is who Bellator is. Yes, we go to Thackerville. All right. But we go to MS.
Poor Thackerville. Let's mention.
Well, I mean, you could sink it to the ocean and no one would miss it. Okay. But here's the point. They're going to MSG. They're going to be on pay-per-view. They are going to sign free agents. They're going to have folks that people know and identify with and recognize. They want to make a destination viewing. They want us to rethink how we think of Bellator. And that's ambitious and it's difficult, but this is the first attempt to do that, and we'll see if they can make it happen.
It's a tough thing to do. When you have think of what Bellator was under Bjorn Rebney. Just the idea of it. It was very difficult to wrap your mind around a scenario where you would have this kind of feeling now. I just don't think that it didn't seem possible. The tournament structure, which everybody hated on, just the way that there's some of the practices. The Bjorn Rebney at the top was kind of a colder figure to have plugged into that role. It just didn't seem like they were going to be able to turn it around. And I know you kind of mentioned this too. I keep referring to this because I thought Scott was actually kind of open on your show. You'd mentioned just basically did he like the name Bellator? And you could tell, you're like, how could you wanted to inherit a name that everybody's like, no thanks, you know what I mean? And I'm sure if he could have, he would have switched it to Strikeforce just like this, and here we go with Strikeforce 2.0. But I commend them on that level, I really do, because I feel like I don't even really associate Bellator to the old Bellator anymore. It just feels to me like Scott Coker's vehicle and all these other guys has a different feeling now.
Maybe instead of the fight cards, maybe they should put the pressers on pay-per-view, because
you liked it that much.
Well,
Wow, I'm surprised. You of all people?
In a funny kind of a way.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily all, it wasn't all great, but it had its various elements, let's say. Chael Sonnen, last week, I was talking about how Chael Sonnen is going to find a way to sell himself, despite the fact that his recent past has not been good. What does he do? He comes out there, and the first thing he talks about how I'm going to come out here, undefeated and undisputed. And I'm thinking, this is what he's going to sell everybody. Even though that his last fight he got tapped out, and then he'll double down and say, I tapped out Tito in less than 60 seconds, and then he'll talk about Vanderlei Silva and say, well, I know you stink, but you're probably better than Tito. So he's kind of finds a way to sell things. It's almost Trumpian in the way that he creates a reality and acts as though he believes that reality. And as we've seen in the American political system, there are people out there who believe that reality even when we know it's not true.
Okay, it's one thing to sell it, it's another thing to buy it. And I must say, he was on my show, we covered the press conference. The majority of the comments that I saw were, this isn't working. This type of routine isn't working for me right now. So I don't get the sense that the fans are buying it. Is he making a mistake by going back to the Anderson Silva era routine? Should he try to reinvent himself here?
Well, if I were in his shoes, I would, but I'm not in his shoes. I'm not at that level of being a salesman. And I think that there's the one mistake that we should not get into is in thinking that the people who are watching this show or the people who watch the MMA Hour are necessarily the entirety of his target audience. There are people out there, in order to succeed in a pay-per-view, they're going to have to reach other people. And there are other people who might just kind of buy into this stuff. I don't know. I listened to him the other day and I thought, God, I can't imagine buying this thing. I mean, that's really what I came away with. But I've so many times in the past had that reaction in myself and then been proven wrong. So I think that a guy like Chael Sonnen, who is so expert at selling himself, I guess I'm just gonna have to trust that he knows what he's doing.
There was a time when you watched Chael Sonnen when he came up after Okami and Marquardt, and he didn't really stand out all that much other than when he got to Silva, right? And then it became must-see to see him interact with Silva, and this thing went on after that whole UFC 117. He fought, Bisping and guys like that, and you're wondering how is he going to be? It was as big of an intrigue as the fight itself. How will he interact with these fighters? And it's bizarre that we've gotten to this point now, I guess, where shtick is really all he does, because there was a sincerity factor to what he was doing back then. Even if he was going overboard with the Silva stuff, nobody had done that. We were always reverent of Anderson Silva until he came along. That's what made it novel. It was like this nice, different, Silva needed him, that sort of thing. You're now at a point where I don't really feel like he's doing it. His best approach, if you ask me, would have been like, hey, I was embarrassed by the Tito Ortiz fight, and just he's so articulate and so thoughtful just to be the sincere guy through this process. That would have been an interesting tactic. I don't think he necessarily had to be, it's a mismatch in the verbal sparring in this. Wanderlei Silva is just like Tito Ortiz. He's not going to be able to compete in this thing. But that's why,
especially if
we did learn though that Wanderlei Silva is still breathing.
Sure.
So that's
in a very labored and loud way. Yes. Look, it's undeniable. Is there Chael fatigue? I think there's a little bit of Chael fatigue out there. But I'm always very careful about what hardcore fans say about someone. The Tito Ortiz lesson has been, and I was at that Bellator 120 event when I was like walking into it, man, Tito's going to get booed. And he comes in there and this was, I was like, it was like an alternate dimension how much people love him. And I don't think it'll be quite like that. I do think our people are a little bit sick of what he's done. But, look, you were there as well. He was the life of the party. And maybe it didn't translate over on video, but being there, you had Brent Primus down to Fedor, down to Matt Mitrione and Larkin. These are not guys who say a whole lot. They're dynamic fighters, and they deserve to be on that stage, but there was no sizzle to it other than what he was doing, and it was casting a halo over everything. And I think some people are a little bit tired of that, and if he doesn't deliver, we talked about this before, I think that could be quite problematic for his career. But if he goes in there and wins and brings some of that sincerity factor back, I think we'll look back on this and say he sold it absolutely correctly. So I don't really have too much of an issue with it.
The most notable thing that I thought Chael did on Tuesday at that press conference, which, by the way, I thought he saved it. I mean, it would have been
pulling off his shoe. I was laughing so hard.
It was the shots at Fedor, because Chael's brilliance has always been set up the next one.
Yeah.
And now he's starting to set up.
McGregor, right? This is something they share in common.
And now he's, putting out that he asked to fight Fedor. He knew he wasn't going to get that fight on, 3 hours notice. And then talking smack about Fedor sitting right next to him is kind of, next level arrogance, if you will. Like, it takes real chutzpah to do that to someone like Fedor, who is revered by everyone. So I thought that was the most interesting thing that he actually did. It had nothing to do with Wanderlei Silva. Let me take a quick step back here, talking about the pay-per-view. I don't think that this is the best Bellator has to offer. I don't think this, if they were going to sit back in January and say, okay, come summertime, we're going to put on a pay-per-view. Let's try to align the stars to put out our best product possible, because I feel like a title fight should be at the top. I feel like Rory should be fighting Lima and Larkin should be fighting Daly, if we're going to be honest, given their resumes. And so there's a few things here or there that I wish they did a little differently. But what I do like about it, and what's promising to me, is in the past, when they've had these cards like Royce and Ken, Dada and Kimbo, or these other cards like Kimbo and Ken, these ones that were much maligned by us, the hardcores, they never used those fights to showcase their younger talent. And now they're using the old-timers to showcase the real talent, the talent that's going to be around in 5-6 years, hopefully the next Rockholds and Cain Velasquez's and Gilbert Melendez's of the world, Pico, Gallagher, Larkin, who they just signed, Chandler, Lima. Now they're finally getting it. They're using the old guys to build up the young guys, and I don't feel like they did that in the past. So that's what's really exciting to me about this card. They're finally getting it. I wish there was a title fight at the top, and then you go Chael, Wanderlei, and then maybe one other, and then, the Picos and the Gallaghers of the world. But this at least is an indication that a lesson has been learned, because they did nothing, in my opinion, to build up new stars off the backs of Ken, Royce, and Kimbo in the past.
Didn't Chandler fight on a bunch of those cards? I feel like he did.
It didn't. Okay, so he did fight on the St. Louis card.
Yep.
But it felt to me like he was a little more of an afterthought. I mean, he wasn't fighting for a belt.
Right.
That was when he won and everything. So
Right.
it just
It
feels
seemed like more of a connection to St. Louis, really.
Yes.
Than it did the actual.
He walked out with the video package was the arch of
Sure, yeah, and by the way, they didn't have the luxury of having a Pico and a Gallagher and these younger guys,
Right.
and who knows who
It's
else is
also
gonna
true,
be.
yep.
I mean, they've done a lot of work in signing these younger guys. It just feels like I'm okay. Look, I'm not going to compare Chael Vanderlei to Kimbo Ken. I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Yep.
But it just feels like, okay, now we're starting to see a little bit of the future. Like putting Pico on this card makes a lot of sense. And to be honest, I didn't think it was coming. I didn't think it was coming this soon.
And what they said was they were going to put a female fight on that spike portion. I'm guessing it might be McFarlane, maybe Ducati.
Well, McFarlane was just added on.
Oh, right, so it won't be her, but...
I know that Carrie Ann Melendez is on the card. I don't know if it's on that portion.
So there you go. But anyway,
Yes.
these people that can do things for them and they need to put on Spike, they're making good use of Spike. The only thing is I would say just is I completely agree. The only caveat is, I mean, we talked about like what happens when UFC stacks a show. You were a little bit apprehensive about it because the aftermath
Sure.
of leaves. I'm less on that camp, but I'm a little bit more inclined for the Bellator side because if Bellator does put their best show possible, it's going to be a lot of Thackerville nubbins after that. So they got to be
I
careful.
will also say that I've kind of done a little bit of a 180 after talking to some people and just thinking about it a little more because we asked each other, like, why are they doing pay-per-view? Why pay-per-view now?
Yeah.
And two things came to mind. First of all, after doing a bit of research, it costs a lot of money to rent Madison Square Garden. I mean, it costs an insane amount of money to rent Madison Square Garden. It's the most expensive arena. So A, you have to take that into account. And B, we have to realize that, look who's on the card, right? Chael, Vanderlei, Mitrione, Fedor, Chandler, Larkin. What do all these people have in common? They all recently signed big money deals with Bellator in the last year. You got to pay those contracts off somehow. You can't just put them on free TV. So this is kind of the necessary evil. If we want to see Bellator sign names, big money deals, free agents, they have to do pay-per-view. And now it kind of makes a little more sense to me. Someone actually at Bellator, a very high-ranking person, told me that at the top, Viacom right now is telling them, and this was the quote, go build the 27 Yankees. Do not stop now. We want you to keep going, because they're seeing the positive press. They're seeing what it could lead to,
That's
MSG
interesting.
pay-per-view. Don't stop now. And so I foresee, I think this is kind of the story of the year thus far. It has been a very quiet year compared to 2016, but their aggressiveness in the pay-per-view market, I see them being even more aggressive very soon. And I think that that's a good thing. And one last thing on this. I've noticed, because, we've been very Bellator-centric on this show, on my show, at the press conference on Tuesday, and I've seen just so many negative comments from fans, quote-unquote fans, online. And people have been telling me for a year or so that Zuffa pays people to go online and disparage the competition. And
AstroTurfing is what it's
I
called.
never believed this. and I can't really I can't wrap my head around it. I mean, like, why? This is the first time that it actually crossed my mind, like maybe this is actually a thing. And they will swear by it that this is a thing, that it happens currently. Go on the UG, go on Twitter, go on Instagram. I'll post a picture about Bellator on Tuesday, I'll tweet something, and the first 10 comments, they suck, this sucks, I'm not paying for it, $50, blah, blah, blah. Why so negative? If you are a true fan of mixed martial arts, I get it. You want to see the best fight the best. But why are you so negative right off the bat? You can't see.
Compared to UFC
negative?
208.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at some of the. It's not like every UFC pay-per-view is striking.
Right.
Like the imagination.
It's almost like
gold.
they take it personal. Like,
Yeah.
how dare you charge me for this? How dare?
But have you ever gone on the internet to read anything and then look at the comments?
This is almost like alarming. It's
Really?
amazing to see.
More than
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
it's like
I
the
totally
Trump
agree with
bots.
you.
You don't.
I agree with
You
you.
guys don't notice it?
I notice it 100%.
Okay.
I'm actually glad you bring it up, because honestly, sometimes I think maybe I'm just seeing specific examples. When I write something about Bellator or whatever, you just feel like there's a negative cloud that hovers over it immediately. It is an interesting thing.
But there's a couple of differences, though.
Yeah.
We should appreciate them just a little bit.
Who's them?
Us, about this scenario. I think the first one is that I do agree that there is this negative thing. If there's astroturfing, I don't know. Zuffa's been caught explicitly
Why is it called
astroturfing.
astroturfing?
I don't know.
Okay.
But
That's the term
that's
for
that's the
paying-
technical of intentionally sort of filling up comment sections or people's responses.
This is a thing.
It's a thing.
By the way,
Astroturfing.
if there is anyone out there who has been hired to do this specifically
Tell us.
about,
Yeah.
I would love to talk to you. Just saying.
I have. Look,
Please reach out.
even
Wink
if
at us in
even
the
if
comment
it's,
section.
but here's the thing. Let's assume for a second there is zero astroturfing.
Yeah.
I have no idea if it is, but let's assume for just a moment it's not. You still get a fair amount of organic negative responses to them, so we can at least say that that's there. But here's the truth about it. And one thing, you've talked to Coker more than I have, but I've talked to him enough now where I get a sense where he doesn't really care what the hardcore fan thinks. That's not exactly true. he's unencumbered by it. I think that's a better way to put it. He's always thinking about that casual audience over there. How do I get them? I've got you, bozos. You're not. You can say whatever you want on the UG. I've got you. I want you over there. He's always thinking that way. So for me, I don't think they're bothered that much by it. And I will say this too. Look, anybody who's going to be a competitor to the UFC, and we should be very clear about this, Bellator is still a super distant second, okay? Not even close. But to the extent you are at least perceived to be in proximity of them, you're going to get some kind of outrage. King Mo has talked about this. There are MMA fans and there are UFC fans, and in many cases that's not an overlapping Venn diagram. But what I will say is this. I remember when Strikeforce was around, man, they used to get torn to shreds by people. And you go back and you look on those cards now, you're like, my God, these cards were amazing. Bellator is getting some of that, but they're also getting, I'm seeing some of this too. Like, wow, you know what? Good for Larkin. I'm glad Bellator was smart enough to pick up on him. I mean, I wanted to see him in the UFC, but okay, this is good. And I'm glad Michael Chandler's on this card. And you know what? I'm a little bit tired about Vanderlei versus whatever, but I'm glad to see Fedor. Like, there's a little bit of this sense whereas Strikeforce was seen as this obstacle to making the best fight the best, Bellator is receiving a little bit of this idea of they're not an obstacle to the best fight and the best. In fact, they're a vehicle to give guys who are underserved a platform to shine.
Yeah, I've been seeing a little bit of that as well. That's kind of number two, let's support the underdog, but it's not just the underdog. It's not so much supporting Bellator. It's kind of more saying the fighters are getting a better shake. They're not having to be encumbered by a Reebok deal. That whole thing that we've talked about on the show many times about the fighters having a union or some sort of association, that hasn't really gotten the momentum that we expected it to. But this is almost like an alternative to that. That the more fighters who can either sign with Bellator or at least be wooed by Bellator, the better for those fighters and for the fighter community in general. And I think some fans look at that and say, good for them. They're giving the fighters a fairer shake.
You had Coker on your show. I spoke to him as well. I thought maybe the most interesting thing that he said was, this is all happening a little sooner than I thought, and it's in large part due to Reebok. UFC kind of expedited this movement. Like, he was talking about a 5-year plan. It's happened in, 2.5 years. That's a kind of a very honest thing for Scott Coker. He's not,
He usually would never say something like that.
Yeah, usually he kind of keeps. Also, he mentioned, hey, 200,000 pay-per-view buys. I'll take that. He actually put a number on it, and it's not a very impressive number, but good to know where his head is at. They also announced $49.99 for the pay-per-view. Is that a mistake? Is that too high? Or is that the right number?
I see a lot of people being like, oh, you should sell it for $29.95.
Well, you're not going to make any money.
I know. It's A, you're not going to make any money.
You have to split it with
and
the
B,
pay-per-view.
That's a figure everybody knows.
It's like, that's what you pay for a monster truck pay-per-view.
Right.
I mean, this is, I've bought porn that's almost that expensive. I mean, for crying out loud, this is nothing. And that wasn't even that good as a porn.
That also is the suggested retail price that he said, and he said some cable companies or satellite will do differently, which is what, we talked about this last week. He created a kind of a disparity from the top dollar to the bottom dollar. I think it was $30 in some markets for their first pay-per-view to the $50. So there'll be probably some places where this thing will be available for cheaper.
If you do 200,000 buys and you drop your price by $5, you've lost $1 million already. Already, it's $1 million. That's nothing to sneeze at. You know what I mean? So they can't really lower it that much. I actually asked him how much room do you have to play with? He didn't say a whole lot. I think, look, if you look at the pay-per-view price and you look at the ticket sale prices, they're all modestly relaxed. It's
you
not
like the ticket sale prices?
Yeah, so
$1,000 for the most.
For the most, and then and they have a couple, but they have one that's below 100, which the UFC didn't. Right. So they've got they've modestly relaxed the price points. They're trying to give an alternative to the UFC that's a little bit cheaper, a little bit less of a product, but they don't want to be like, hey, this is the flea market where you can just get easy, simple deals for picking up someone else's old used garbage. That's what they don't want to do.
As far as the free agency goes, it's really been like a two-way street between UFC, Bellator, UFC. The odd WSOF guy comes over to the UFC, and then there's like the European guys. To me, the real sign of, okay, is there a real free agency going on here? WSOF to Bellator. Does Bellator go after like a Justin Gaethje? You know what I mean? Because we all kind of think like, okay, Branch is gone, he's going to UFC. Marlon Moraes is gone, he's going to UFC. But what if they intercept one of those guys? Now, to me, it's like, okay, you guys are really serious here about this free agency stuff. You're not just going for the big splashes. You're actually trying to build these divisions. And I think Gaethje would be perfect for them at 155. They don't have a lot of guys at 155 right now. I mean, just witness the fact, with all due respect to Brent Primus, he's not really on everyone's radar. He's fighting for the belt. That, to me, is going to be the real sign.
Imagine if the pay-per-view was going to be Chandler against Gaethje. Just imagine if that fight was on there because of their styles.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
But the thing about that is, though, everyone's like, oh, they keep just getting all these UFC guys.
Yeah.
Not a coincidence. They want guys that the UFC has promoted.
Right.
And when that relationship fails, then they pick them up. No one's ever really promoted Justin Gaethje. I mean, I know the World Series of Fighting has done their best, and I acknowledge that. And
a valiant effort, if there was one.
but in the end, and look, they put him on NBC.
Sure, no,
they put him on NBC a couple times, so that's something to be said for that. But in the end, how powerful is that machine? I don't know if they're going to get him. Maybe they will, because he's such an action fighter.
Yeah.
But my guess is they're going to wait for guys who've been, they didn't get Aljamain Sterling either, right? They want guys who've been really promoted.
Sure.
Yeah, obviously, it's not just about how good a fighter you are. It's about how big your name is.
Sure.
And not to say that everybody that comes over from the UFC is a big name within the UFC universe, but they're people that many folks recognize. They know who that guy is. Oh yeah, I watched that pay-per-view between these two guys, and that guy was a little bit down on the card, but I remember him. And that's all you need, just to have somebody who's recognized, just to cloud the waters a little bit and say, oh yeah, I sort of remember that guy.
So UFC was off last weekend. They're off this weekend, which I actually think is really good for 210. And we'll talk a little bit about 210 in a second. But I feel like it kind of gets you a little more excited for the Cormier-Rumble fight. Bellator has a show tomorrow, Friday night, and it's headlined by Rampage Jackson versus King Mo, their rematch. And it's an interesting headliner, and the rest of the card is quite thin, to be honest. But it's, to me, interesting for two reasons. The first is Rampage Jackson is fighting in his last fight on his Bellator contract, and he has to go back to the UFC once this fight is up, because he had signed that deal with them. They paid for a lot of his legal fees, and then the injunction and everything, went back to Bellator, signed that 2-year deal, but now 2-fight deal, and now has to go back if he wants to keep fighting. So that, to me, is fascinating. Here he is in this kind of like, not loser leaves town, but he's leaving town. If this was pro wrestling, he would put King Mo over. This is not pro wrestling, so he can, knock out King Mo in 10 seconds and then walk over to the UFC. That's fascinating. It's also fascinating, I think, because on ESPN last weekend, he said that his biggest regret, as far as this sport and his time in this sport is concerned, is getting into this sport in the first place. And the reason for that, as he put it, was he misses his family, he doesn't live in Memphis, he didn't see his sister grow up, et cetera, et cetera. How did you guys take in this comment? Because Rampage has been known to be, at times, somewhat of a moody fellow, a prickly fellow. No one knows this better than I. But part of me kind of felt a little sad when I heard this. I mean, I was like, man, at the twilight of his career, if he really views his entrance into this sport as a regret, that kind of bums me out a little bit. Am I looking at this a little
That's
too?
how you sell a fight. Regret. That's what's.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
I hate this sport.
Forget about selling the fight. Just the comment itself. By the way, I don't begrudge him for saying it. It was amazingly honest. Like, I love that. That's great. Good for him. Good for ESPN for getting it. But it just kind of made me a little bit sad.
I think everybody has. That's the interesting thing, is he said it. He's on this platform. He says something like that. I think everybody goes through introspectively regrets, right? I felt like I could almost relate to him in a weird way, because you're like, any path you take at some point, you're going to look back and think about the other paths you didn't and what you might have compromised in doing that path. And I felt like that was just one of those moments. He's always been that guy who will, he'll throw curveballs and get real serious with you after he's joking around and stuff. You're like, whoa, man, I didn't anticipate that, that sort of thing. But I kind of understood where he was going with it. He's at an age, too, where his career's winding down. He's like 30.
Yeah, he's up there.
39.
39. So, you're at an age, I think, where you might grow a little introspective. He's thinking about his 8-year-old sister he helped raise and, where she's at now. But it's also unique, though, just given that he's had such success in the sport. Like, it'd be one thing if he was a guy, a journeyman who just hung around forever, and here he is at this spot. But he's actually been a champion where he's, and been a huge star, made a lot of money, got movie roles. One of the things, like he was mentioning Memphis, not being there, UFC tried to design a show in Memphis at UFC 107 for him, and he gets the A-team role and doesn't even get to go back. Sure. So it's even interfering.
He did for Bellator 120.
Yeah, but I mean in that particular time, so you could see how he's been intercepted in a lot of ways, and it's just gone that way. But I took it two ways. I just took it as Rampage Jackson is probably having a normal introspection moment, but he's doing it on national TV, which he's prone to do, things like that. And then just you know, something where everybody goes through some layer of that, and he just happened to be going through that at the time.
Well, he did talk about making about some people cheating him out of money, or some comments that made it sound like he has not been enriched by the sport. And I know, as you said, he has made some money. He made movies and stuff like that. So he's done some things that you would think would have put him in a position of being financially set. But it sounded like, from those comments, that he may not be financially set, and maybe through some either real or perceived dirty dealings that went his way and made him, you know, this guy who now is toward the end of his career and is not set for life. And maybe that is also a impetus for looking back and thinking about what could have been. I mean, I thought it was an honest moment as well, and I know he afterward kind of was upset the way people took it, but people are going to take things you say in an odd way. I don't think
also very Rampage.
I don't think he regrets, you know, being a fighter. I think he just kind of regrets the stuff that didn't happen in his life that would have happened if he had just stayed home.
You know, I actually really appreciated it.
Yeah.
I don't know that I feel sorry for him, because in the grand scheme of things, he elected to do this, and he has done well. What's interesting about it is a lot of times you hear people talk about how the fight game did them wrong, and he has some of those hallmark things. You know, his relationships have been frayed with people like Juanito Ibarra and others. But, you know, he's probably going to be a Hall of Famer.
Whatever that means.
Well, I mean, let's think about that for a second. He was there for the peak of Pride. He was there for the peak of UFC, and he's there for, like, the best moments Bellator's ever had. Like, and he won a gold, too. And he was in the 8th. I mean, like, this guy is a winner. That's really what he is.
Does anyone doubt that if there was a Hall of Fame?
I'm just saying. I'm pointing out, like, that's typically you don't hear Hall of Famers speak this way, right? But you know what's interesting to me about it is, I have to say, I find that, number one, some of the fan reaction was like, here's Rampage complaining again. And it is true that Rampage complained at the end of every stage of his career. Okay, so maybe he'll feel differently in a year or two. Who knows? But this idea that, like, celebrities or successful people aren't entitled to share their human pain, I find a grotesque thing that people push against. Number two, and this may be my own personal pet peeve, but you hear a lot of celebrities, you know, when they finish, or particularly athletes, you know, no regrets, man, I left it all out there. These are narcissistic, evil people. To say something like, I do have regret, I feel like I made some wrong choices, and I feel like I'm suffering from it, that is, I mean, you want people to express human emotions like this, right? And the other part about it is, I just think it's a reality. Look, when he beat Chuck Liddell and he was on top of the world, he probably had a certain amount of money coming in at all times and fans and stuff. And look, I'm sure he still gets recognized on the street, but he hates training. He's always hated training. He's a lot older now. I'm sure he has money saved, but the money's not what it used to be coming in. The popularity's probably not what it used to be. He knows the end is here, and he's probably saying to himself, now where am I? I've got some money saved up. I've got a lime green Lamborghini that looks idiotic, and I'm nowhere near my family. What have I really profited from this? And again, he may change his mind in a year or two, but that kind of examination is probably a good thing, and I don't begrudge him for it, not even a little bit.
So do you view this as Rampage being Rampage? Or do you feel like in a weird... basically, how does this play into Friday night? Because Friday night he's fighting King Mo.
It's a bad sign.
So, and then, okay, so this is a heavyweight fight, and I know we kind of joked that they weren't sure. Here's some news. I don't know if it's out there because I haven't been on my phone, but they weighed in this morning. So King Mo weighed in at 212 pounds. It's a heavyweight fight.
That's about as big as he gets.
Up till 265. Do you have any idea what Rampage weighed in at? Well, if you know, then this game is not going to work.
I don't, but I saw Tiki Ghost on Instagram tweeting about it yesterday.
Well, now it's kind of...
No. I'm going to say 235.
253.
He's dyslexic.
Yeah, that's right.
253?
Is that a warning sign? Is that someone, given these comments, given that he doesn't like to train? I mean, because to me, it's always dangerous when a guy who, like, I think of BJ Penn, when he was fighting GSP, and I had a chance to work on that primetime show. 155, or killer at 155, pushing himself, making weight. You get a chance at 170, you don't push yourself. You don't have to lose the weight. You don't have to train as hard. It's always very tricky. Now, Rampage has that extra 60 pounds from 205 to 265 to play with. Notoriously doesn't like to train. I worry that he didn't go all in this training camp. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he looks great at 253. I hope for his sake. But that number kind of jumped out at me, given the comments, coupling them together.
I mean, in the first fight wasn't a barn burner.
Yeah.
It's not like you saw something in that fight that makes you think that this one's going to be completely fun and fireworks. But that's definitely not a good sign. When I would have if I would have guessed, I would have guessed around that.
Yeah.
Because I knew he wasn't going to try to make 205. But that's. I mean, you're now at the upper stretch of heavyweight, which is kind of crazy.
Dude, that's like bigger than Stipe Miocic.
Yeah, and he's not as tall.
I guess if he goes back to UFC, it's heavyweight division once.
What's your level of interest at this point in Rampage Jackson? Because I do agree that he's a Hall of Famer. I still agree that he's somewhat of a star. Like, you can't promote a show around him. I think if he wins this fight, the UFC would be happy to have him back. I mean, he may not be the easiest guy to work with, but in this day and age where you're putting on 43 shows and the first half of the year has been relatively thin. I mean, Rampage Jackson is Rampage Jackson.
He's also won 5 in a row.
Sure, yeah. I mean, he's no scrub. There's no doubt about it. What's your level of interest?
I'll always watch a Rampage Jackson fight if it's offered to me. I'm not that interested in seeing him headline a fight card. And the other thing about him, and this is something that goes back to his later fights in the UFC, I've often felt as though he no longer embodies his nickname. I don't think that he creates that rampage that he once did when he was in the fights. Even when he's out there, he's won 5 in a row, even when he's out there winning, he just doesn't have that whatever it is, that extra special something, that extra level of violence that he always used to have. I don't feel like it's there, at least not in any kind of sustainable way, maybe in a little spurt. So that's been always my line when I've written about him, that he's a guy who's in search of his next nickname.
It's funny, King Mo actually said the same thing yesterday. He said he calls him Quinton because when's the last time he rampaged anyone?
He probably read my stuff then.
Yeah, probably.
You know what? It's sad. To gauge level of interest, mine's pretty low.
Is it?
I've been to a bunch of Rampage fights. Folks used to forget, like, you go back, everyone remembers the Arona fight. Arona was this incredible Abu Dhabi champion, and he was on his way to winning, and Rampage was a force of nature back then. Even before the Sakuraba fight, which he was set up to fail in, he lost that one, I believe, but he was still, he was ragdolling Sakuraba for big portions of that fight. That's who he was. He was the guy that overcame technical deficits with just ferocity. He was like an X-Men or something. It was insane to watch. There's just so very little of that left. And when you're at heavyweight and you're like, I regret even doing this, and you're fighting a guy who is very motivated to beat you. And look, Mo, I don't think he ever really recovered from that staph infection.
No.
And he's still. But here's what I do know about Mo: he's still dangerous, and he's going to give maximum effort, 1,000%. So it's MMA's crazy, but it doesn't look good for him.
It just feels like too he's had his foot half out the door for so long. I mean, even going back to UFC 145 when he was fighting Bader, it just seemed like he didn't want to, he talked about it in such a way that was just fatigue. Fatigue came across, like, I have to fight this wrestler. I have to do these things. And it's like, at some point, that just you can't build enthusiasm for him. If he doesn't have the enthusiasm to sell his own fights, then fans are just going to naturally lose enthusiasm to watch him. But I agree, it's not like he's kind of snoozing on the way to the cage, and then he gets in there and he's a different guy, and he goes right through somebody. We haven't really seen that version of him either, so I think it's all hand in hand. At some point, he's just not the same guy.
He barely got by Ishii.
Look at the other side of it. King Mo, it's an opportunity for him. I mean, King Mo has certainly had a good career to this point, but it's still Rampage Jackson. Whether or not he lives up to that nickname, and both King Mo and I would say he doesn't, and I'm sure a lot of other people would say he doesn't, but he still has that nickname. It's still Rampage Jackson on your resume. If he goes out there and has a great performance, and if I'm King Mo and I hear that number, 253, man, that's going to add to my fire, because I'm going to say this is a guy that I can take out, who's not himself, a guy who is himself plus one, So it's a guy. I think that King Mo is going to have this opportunity to really have a star turn tomorrow night.
And Mo really wants to fight on that MSG card, and I'm not saying a loss would preclude him from doing that, but a big win would, I think, book his seat at the table, maybe against Ryan Bader, since they're not doing that title fight against Phil Davis. They don't want to have 3 titles on that card. It's always interesting when you hear a fighter talk about retirement going into a fight. I've never quite heard someone talk about regretting even doing this to begin with. That's a whole other level of like, I wonder how he looks on Friday night. Okay, let me ask you guys about Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping this week essentially issuing an ultimatum to GSP saying, look, buddy, I want to fight in July. Yeah, we did the press conference. We agreed. What are we waiting for here? And I would like to bet that someone in the UFC is trying to tell him to, like, come on, Mike, you know, get GSP to hurry this thing up.
AstroTurfing.
They need this fight for that show, the July 8th show. We talked about Tony Ferguson versus Nate, which I think would be a fine fight, but like there's not a lot going on as of right now. We know Verdum, Alistair 3 is on it, but that's on a headliner. And so Bisping's coming out and saying, like, come on, let's go. And if you don't hurry up, I'm going to fight Yoel Romero. Anyone believe that he's being serious here?
It makes total sense to me that the UFC would want those words to be spoken. It makes zero sense to me that Michael Bisping would say those words, because he went further and said, well, why should I wait for GSP? I can end up fighting 2 fights in that amount of time and make the same amount of money. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if the Washington Post comes to me tomorrow and says, you know, instead of paying you this amount to write that story a month from now, we're going to pay you half as much to do a story tomorrow and then another one in a month. That's twice as much work, and I'm not getting hit. I'm not getting punched.
Right.
I'm not putting myself, you know, into danger with a guy like Yoel Romero. It makes no sense for Michael Bisping to want to fight 2 fights to make the same amount of money he can make to fight 1 fight against, you know, GSP. Now, of course, GSP is a legend, but he's a guy who's been off for a certain amount of time, and it's enough time to create some ring rust. And if his alternative is to go in and fight a killer who's primed to kill in Yoel Romero, and then if he survives that, to go out and fight again, that makes no sense at all. So I'm not quite sure where Michael Bisping's going.
Michael Bisping has a platform in the media is because he understands how to do media, right? Like, he understands what he's doing. He's a very smart guy. And I heard that, and you think, your initial reaction was like, what, are you crazy? But then you're like, okay, wait a minute. He's playing a game here. He's trying to, whatever it is, like he's, my guess is something like that. They're like, hey, let's put some pressure on him to get something definitive in the works here, because I think we all are wondering. But you have been talking about from the very beginning, before he signed GSP, that it would probably be the fall. So I feel like this is
GSP himself said it.
GSP. So I'm like, you know, this line of thinking is a little weird. I do feel like Michael Bisping, as the champion, still feels disrespected on some level, that people don't take him as a serious champion. He doesn't want to be dictated terms to. But I honestly believe that there's something obviously behind the scenes going on here for him to sue it, because there's absolutely no way he's going to want to fight, or he's going to give Romero a shot before he do a GSP. That just makes no sense at this point.
Very fake news. Very fake news.
Sad.
Very sad, exclamation point. Very unprecedented. Do yourself a favor, for anyone watching this right now. This is a true thing you can do. Go and look up, Google Michael Bisping, prize fighter, mixed martial artist, right? Those words together. What you'll find is that when Michael Bisping went and fought Anderson Silva, however many moons ago, there's an article, I believe it was in The Guardian, where he said, I object to the term prize fighter. I'm a martial artist. You know, he's trying, and it was a great piece, and he comes off amazing in it. In fact, you should read it for his own sake.
Right.
But then, just before the GSP versus Bisping fight was announced, he went on the UFC Unfiltered podcast. And in it, he opens the conversation by going, don't call me a mixed martial artist.
What?
I'm a prize fighter. This is what we do. We're in a cage. In other words, what do I think he really thinks? I don't know Michael all that well, but from what I do know,
Colleagues.
Yeah, well, look, we don't get on the phone. I mean, but the point being is, I think he probably, like every other fighter, thinks of himself as a mix between the two. When he's talking to The Guardian to promote the sport, he'll say one thing. When he's trying to get a fight, he'll say another. So this is really all this is. I am certain he's getting his arm twisted, and he probably wants that thing. But like, even if he beats GSP, he has said explicitly he might retire, even if he wins.
Right.
This idea that, like, I may just fight Romero and then lose and then give up on the GSP fight, that he has said.
When said like that.
He has even said, like, the payday I would get, he told me this personally, the payday he would get from GSP would be at a minimum 3 times any other payday he's ever had. Yeah. You're just going to give that up because the bus is a little late? Very fake news.
Yeah, he's never even made $1 million for a fight. I mean, that's what he said.
Yeah.
We don't know if it's true. They are facing a predicament, though, because they want this fight to be in July. And, you know, Conor and Floyd is still there. And if that September 16 date is actually the one, if it comes to fruition, you're not going to do this. Okay, so I tweeted this out, that it would be very bad business. It would make very minimal business sense to put this fight same month GSP Bisping same month as Floyd Conor, and then a lot of people are writing to me like, it's 2 different sports, we don't care about the Floyd. They're not gonna do that, right?
That would be a terrible idea.
How much space do you have to put between these two things?
I mean, 4 weeks at a minimum, either side.
That's the big, GSP Bisping is the biggest, regardless of what we may think of it from a meritocracy standpoint, it's the biggest fight on the table right now,
It's a big
right?
one, Yep.
Floyd Conor is the biggest fight ever involving an MMA fighter, right? How much space do you really need? Like, is 4 weeks enough?
Oh, I'm saying minimum.
Minimum. Okay.
Like on either side of it.
That's right.
You have to bracket out.
July actually makes the most sense if we're going to say July and September, right? It's not going to work out, at least for now. GSP has his reasons, but this is kind of a predicament because Floyd Conor is going to dictate everything, and I think that's kind of the reason why we haven't really found out what's going on in July yet. I mean, that date is rapidly approaching, and so.
And the other part about this, just to go back, I don't know what kind of numbers Mayweather McGregor might do, but I suspect if in fact this fight comes to fruition on these kinds of dates you're talking about, they're going to charge $100 for that thing.
Yeah.
Which is the price of basically 2 pay-per-views.
That's the problem. That's the problem. You have to take that into account. I mean, that's 1 month cycle as far as like your direct TV bill is concerned.
Yep.
You're really going to have like $160 in pay-per-view, purchases on there if you're buying both. So this could, I fear that they're trying to, or I wonder if they're trying to expedite this and get him to, to jump, GSP that is, because they know this is coming and you can't have it in September and then you can't really have it in October. And now you're talking about November? This is kind of
to the magnitude of that fight, McGregor thing, that we even have this conversation. Sometimes you catch yourself and you're like, wow, what would that fight mean? And when we start talking around it like this, like that's when you realize it's always in things like that where you're actually considering the impact it'll have around it by 4 weeks each way. I mean, that's a crazy type of thing. I would almost rather, though, it be 2 months after than try to go 4 weeks before. You know what I mean? Because
now you're really, if
I know, but I'm saying, of course, I'm saying like if you're thinking of it like only in terms of that, if I'm setting that fight up.
But if you're a GSP, do you really succumb to pressure because you're not going to get a middleweight title fight in the new world order of the UFC? Is it really? Is the title really that important? Now it's about the big money fights, and GSP can generate big money fighting somebody else. It's almost like McGregor when he originally was, he got pulled off one card. You can just make some money. So maybe GSP ends up with a different fight against a different guy, and it happens after.
Well, does GSP Woodley sell less than GSP Bisping?
Okay, but here's the deal. We have to think about this. Like, this is really kind of a complicated thing. I can see why the UFC might be breathing down Michael's neck. If they put that fight in August, who knows? Some people are going to say, I'm going to wait till September for that. Here's the other problem. If that fight between Mayweather and McGregor sucks, which is a strong propensity, it might. I'm just saying it might. Like, look, if Conor goes and shocks the world, oh my God. But if he goes in there and he looks bad and he gets beat, like most people suspect that he probably will, people will think, oh, well, then they'll be jazzed to see Bisping versus GSP as like a rebound fight. No, it would depress interest generally. I remember after Mayweather-Pacquiao, everyone had a sour taste in their mouth for a while, and eventually everyone rebounds, don't get me wrong, but imagine seeing a UFC fighter, if this happens, punked by a 40-year-old Mayweather. That would depress interest, I think, generally. You don't want to
for the casuals, but you think the hardcores will feel that way?
Okay, the hardcore. There's 5 hardcore fans.
Is there?
We're talking about the mass audience.
Sure.
What's the point of having a money fight between GSP and Bisping if you're not going to attract casuals?
Right. Okay, and then what about this whole thing that seems to pop up between Bisping and Tyron Woodley? Like, I like both these guys very much. I mean, I like them. They need to stop with this shtick. It's so transparent. You both work for Fox. You tweet each other in the middle of the whole thing, like, please stop.
Your mother smells. No, your mother's fat.
Like, 2 of my favorite people in the sport, but they need to stop this back and forth. Like, no one's asking for this fight. There's a long queue of guys at 170 and 185 to fight both of them. It just feels like they were sitting in the back in the avocado room at Fox, as they like to call it. That's their green room. And they concocted this plan to try to make their own money fight. But I'm not buying it. Like, does anyone want to see this?
No, not really.
But isn't that what this is all about now? Now in the era of Conor McGregor,
yes,
everybody else wants to be Conor McGregor, not necessarily fight in his style, but talk in his style or generate money in his style.
I don't think it's a Conor McGregor thing. This has been happening forever. People trying to make fights. But this is the wrong fight. People
overvalue the importance of stuff like this. Sometimes I think if it really was like that, they come together and they, hey, you know what we should do is this. They're overvaluing that situation that they think will take off. And from the earliest moments of this thing going on, it's been pretty much a thud. I just don't feel like anybody really is talking about that fight. So at some point, you got to say that's not what people want.
Right. We reward fighters for speaking out and asking for a fight. We have said it explicitly time after time.
Sure.
Hell, the matchmakers appreciate it because it lightens their load a little bit. It's the same thing. Everyone got, I mentioned this in my lap, everyone got all bitter at Vitor Belfort for calling out CM Punk. And of course, that is the most outrageous, ridiculous thing ever. But the only thing that really matters is, can you sell it to an audience? Do they find it palatable or not? Might as well throw out the fishing line and see if anything
Yeah, but
bites.
there is a difference. We were talking about this off air. There's a difference between calling someone out and getting us excited and then just acting delusional. When Kevin Lee gets on the mic and says, my fans want it, Khabib's fans want it, we want to see this fight, the world wants to see it, that's delusional. You know what I mean? When we say
I think it's a thin line between them.
Yes, but
Vitor
when you-
asking for CM Punk
Delusional.
is perhaps the most delusional thing I've ever seen in my life.
That is delusional too. Now you're wasting our
I think
time.
he was joking around. I don't think that was.
I understand. Okay. But if someone came to me like, you know what, Vitor? That's a pretty good idea. He'd be like, yes, it is. Yes, it is a good idea. I guarantee it.
I'm just saying, when we ask for fighters to speak up, we're not asking for them to sound delusional. Like, we want them to get us excited.
They have to
But what's
calibrate. They have to,
delusional?
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
They have to
What is
calibrate
delusional?
that.
Delusional,
I mean,
there's.
when you're the 15th ranked guy, you can't call it the first ranked guy.
Unless you're Dan Henderson and you get a title shot
Well,
right
that's
from it.
different. You have a resume
The
to back
line
up
has
your.
been shifting on what is delusional and what is real.
Exactly right.
Sure,
No
sure.
one really knows, is the truth. What's palatable, what's not.
Rockhold Verdum?
Again, do I care to see this? I'd rather watch WrestleMania. I don't
Yeah,
care
right.
to see it. But the point being is,
watch
if you
Who's
throw
main
out the...
eventing this Sunday?
I legitimately don't know.
I don't believe you for 1 second.
I know Brock Lesnar's
Oh,
appearing.
wow, and now the
Is
truth
there
comes
Rampage
out.
on that fight card?
Might as well be.
There's one half.
Who's the other half?
Come on, you know.
No, actually, I don't know.
know.
George the Animal. No, George died.
Goldberg is the other half?
Yeah, see now
You just said
he
Goldberg.
didn't
say
it.
anything.
So you went from not knowing to actually.
Now I know, you losers. Boy, that is the
Goldberg's in
saddest main event I've ever
WrestleMania?
heard.
God, that's
Okay, let's
They
move.
should put Vitor versus CM Punk on that.
Okay, so next week, some bad news for all of you. Next week there is no MMA Beat because I will be in Buffalo. Chuck will be traveling, so we're off for a week. So let's give 210 some
my
love
daughter's
here.
birthday, too.
It's your daughter's birthday. Happy birthday. How old?
she'll be 12.
12.
Yes, she's
Mazel tov. Bat
She's
mitzvah.
it's basically a teenager, even though she's only going to be 12.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone's getting ready for 210.
What the hell does that mean?
I don't know.
She acts like a
I was just going to
teenager.
move
Let's just say, someday you'll learn.
I'll ask you the same question that I asked about the Rampage fight. What's your level of interest? Because yes, it is thin, but there is a title fight, and it's a rematch of what I thought was a very fun fight, UFC 187. Actually, it's funny, when DC won at 187, Weidman was on the card as well, this time as champion, or that time as champion against Vitor Belfort. Now he's trying to resurrect his career, if you will, against one Gegard Mousasi. But the break, to me, feels like, okay, I'm starting to get excited a little more. How do we feel about this twin bill, if you will?
I'm pretty excited about it. Yeah, I like
Do you
it.
feel like the break helped?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Sure, I'm like kind of, waiting for... Look, here's the truth about 2017. We have not had a big fight yet.
No.
We just haven't. Tony was supposed to be that one, and, everyone knows the story there. We haven't had a big fight yet. I'm not saying that rises to it, but it's a title fight, and it's the light heavyweight division, and it feels pretty close. And here's the other part about it. I feel like we've talked about how the first half of the year is not going to be as good as the second half of the year. And I think that's true generally. I think that's very true for light heavyweight. I think for light heavyweight, you got Serkinov saying, I'm not too far from a title shot. You've got John Jones coming back. I mean, I feel like that's
Manoa.
Yep, I feel like that's really going to start heating up. I'm very excited for that. And look, man, Chris Weidman, this is a huge fight for him. And he looked good on Instagram, doing the flexing and stuff. And I hope he's healthy because certainly you can imagine that Gegard Mousasi realizes this is his time to shine. So, look, the rest of that card, not setting the world on fire, but those two fights, big.
And you mentioned light heavyweight. There's a chance at some point, depending on how this all goes, that Chris Weidman joins those ranks as well, which is kind of a nutty thing. But I do like the idea of them getting that rolling again, because honestly, for years we've been talking about, just what's been going on at light heavyweight. There's so much that's not resolved at the top of it. This at least gets us somewhere. Now, if Johnson goes in there and smokes Cormier, obviously now you're going to have something else. We don't know how that'll play out, but I am intrigued by that fight. The first fight was a lot of fun because, Cormier got rocked. It looked like he might be in trouble. He's able to recover, and he's such a smart fighter. He knows exactly what to do the rest of the fight to get the win. And, he's basically been on record saying, survive 7 minutes of this fight, don't get any stupid 7 minutes, and then stay out of his power range and all that, and then take the fight over. He's just that kind of fighter, and I feel like personally, just having talked to the camp of, Johnson's camp and everything. I'm excited for that fight. The Weidman one gets me a little bit like, I guess we find out, is this his true decline or does he bounce back? So sometimes the stakes are those, when the stakes are like that, the interest level goes up for me.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck just outlined the backstory of those two fights, and I think that the backstory is fairly limited. There's not a lot of drama in either of these fights. That's kind of the way I like it. I mean, when you get really
The more boring, the better.
When you get really good fighters, to me, that's not boring. When you get really good fighters and they're meeting, that is
30 minutes ago, you said you enjoyed that press conference at MSG, the wackiest press conference, the guy's talking to his shoe, and now you're telling me the more boring, the better.
Well, the press conference was just wacky. That's what I enjoy.
You enjoy wacky?
The lunacy of it. But I like when there's fighters who are matched up against each other and it makes sense, and there's one guy deserves a title shot and he gets a title shot. Another one where a guy, we don't know which way he's going to go when he's fighting against a guy who's going to really determine that. That's those are four really good fighters matched up really well. I mean, you can't go wrong with that.
And for light heavyweight, very quickly,
Yeah.
don't forget Gustafsson Teixeira.
Right,
that's on the horizon too.
In May. Yeah, all of a sudden, light heavyweight a little more interesting. And let's not forget about Giga Mousasi. I mean, he's not just the opponent
He's
here.
also this low-grade star who's been just around
he's on
the
a
fight.
roll. Also, he's approaching free agency too. He's talked about this a little bit as well. And there's kind of a logjam at 185. Does he get?
Or Coker guy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And there's vulnerability in every single guy. We saw DC get rocked by Rumble. We saw Rumble get taken down and beaten up. We saw Mousasi get knocked out. We've seen Weidman. So that's the other thing. It's not just guys who just can't lose. We've got guys who have won some big fights and also have lost some big fights.
What about the other 11 fights on that card?
Yeah,
man?
tell me about them. Break them all down right now.
Yeah, come on.
13 fights too many.
Give me two.
Too many. 4 fight pass fights. Okay, but let me ask you guys this. Best case scenario for the UFC. It seems like Jon Jones will get the title shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have to give it to him, even though he's been through all this stuff. And Dana White did tell us that he will never main event a show again, so he'll probably be on Fight Pass when he returns.
Of course.
What's best case scenario, though, in all honesty, for the UFC? Is it the fresh matchup, the one that we were supposed to get, never got, Rumble versus Jones, or is it the rematch now, which has also been teased a couple times along the way? We did get to see it at 182. I thought it was a very fun fight, a dominant win for Jon Jones. What secretly should WME be rooting for here come April 8th?
Cormier, Jones, Cormier Jones too.
You think so?
100%.
Wow. I wonder how many fans would say that.
I know everyone says they've got fatigue over it. Don't buy it. Don't buy it at all. Not to say that the Rumble fight's not super interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, that would be amazing. There's a lot of good options for Jon in that sense. But here's what I would say. I think that there is some unfinished business. The first fight was a lot closer than people remember. And this is Cormier's last stand. If he can get by Johnson, this is, I mean, you're talking about a guy whose career hinges on this fight, truly, and you didn't get the Olympic gold medal. You got the UFC title, but without beating the guy appropriately, this is it, man. Are you going to be that guy, or are you not going to be that guy? That's huge.
It's obviously predicated on how it plays out, but if Cormier goes in there, he's able to, dominate 5 rounds and come away with a win, I don't know. But if Johnson were to go in there and just deliver a power hand, knock him out, to me, that seems bigger. Only in the sense of...
You guys are hating.
Only in the sense of, I wanted to see that fight for a long time.
What if Cormier knocks him out?
What's that?
What if Cormier knocks him out?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. So
Something spectacular.
Emphatic, either way, I think you can't go wrong. But I personally, and I don't know if this would be a popular view, I've always been fascinated, well, since the fight has been talked about, seeing Johnson and Jones go at it, just given the power that he presents against Jones. And Jones, in those last couple fights, he did show a couple times where he left his chin open. Yeah. And so you always want to see, well, this gets a little more interesting. But to me, I'm all about the Cormier-Jones rematch too. But I just think that from the fresh perspective on this fight, especially if he knocks him out.
I'm with Chuck on this one. I think that the Cormier rematch would be certainly interesting. There is some unfinished business, but I don't agree with you, Luke. I think that fight was not any closer than the perception. I think that fight was I think Jones just took him out. I mean, Jones was just in control of that fight all through.
I think it was closer.
Cormier won 2 rounds clean.
And I do think that if you can put Jon Jones in with a guy who has just knocked out Daniel Cormier, knocked him out cold, especially if it's like a fast knockout, first round or something, or whatever, something like that, I think Jones needs to be in there against a guy who looks like he really threatens him. I think that if he goes in against DC again, it's going to be DC with an uphill battle. But I'll take it a step further. I think that whoever wins this fight, I think WME is going to be rooting for that guy to take out John Jones, because John Jones, throughout his career, has been too much trouble for those guys, and they think they'd love to have a guy who, whichever one of these guys wins, is the new king of the hill.
Does anyone disagree that Jones deserves or should get the first, the first crack at these guys?
I'd be happy if he didn't get one, to be honest.
Okay.
In fact, look, there's a big question here about what kind of John Jones you're going to get coming.
I was going to bring that up. Like, we can't just assume it's the 182.
That time off. I mean, he didn't look all amazing at 197, but he got the job done, and that was a late opponent switch. We know the whole story.
Yeah, time off. He's been doing those grappling tournaments and everything.
He's been doing the powerlifting, my favorite. And doing you hit your deadlift on 600, John. But be that as it may. I still think that, like, if they wind up making Jones Cormier, the big drama show, we forgot, the posts from John on Instagram being things like, "You're not the king of the grind, you're nothing." You're the king. I mean, I think we forget what the casual fan might respond to in that particular context, and I think we'll do well.
What would you do with John then, if you're not giving him?
If I had my druthers,
yeah,
I would put him on a main card against someone
like a Manoa.
Manoa, I think deserves Manoa deserves the winner of Gustafsson versus Teixeira.
What do you do for the winner of the title fight?
The
winner of DC. And,
no, it complicates it a little bit. I'm not sure. Here's only my point. I think it'd be in WME's interest to give John a little bit of a quick test and then have a fast turnaround.
You don't think it would be in their best interest, given that there are all these question marks, to put him in that title fight right away?
We keep doing this. We keep doing this every time. We get these people off long layoffs who were somebody good, and they come in and they get steamrolled, and then we're like, what did we do wrong?
Right.
Give this person a manageable task, and if it's manageable enough, they get through it easy enough, quick turnaround.
So maybe the answer, in your opinion, is DC Rumble winner against the Manoa. Let's say it's DC, fresh matchup, DC Manoa. Give John Jones maybe the co-main event against, a younger guy to build him back up. Four-man tournament, if you will.
Something like that. I mean, I don't know
if there's a big demand for Rumble Manoa 2.
No, I don't think so either. But I don't know why you couldn't do John fairly early in the thing and then have it. If they want to put,
he can only come back in July.
Right. The point being is, if they want to have that light heavyweight title fight in July, well, then you just got to give it to him. But if they want to delay it a little bit, I think you could put him in July, then he could fight again in like late August, early September.
The other question that I need to find out the answer to is, can they promote him while he's still suspended? Because his suspension would be up.
That too.
His suspension would be up by July 8th. So we're talking about that show that they need a main event. Could DC Jones, it would feel weird a year after UFC 200 and never came to fruition, but could they promote him on that card even though he's still under that suspension? I will add one other thing to our discussion about, just that main event. I still feel like, as we sit here today, Daniel Cormier is one of the most underrated and underappreciated champions in UFC history, and it's because he never beat John Jones, and it's because he got the belt in this weird circumstance, after Jones got arrested. But if you look at his resume and what he did at heavyweight and what he's done at light heavyweight, it's amazing when I see people say, like, Cormier sucks, I'm so tired of Cormier. Like, Cormier is really, really freaking good.
Why do they say that? Is it just 'cause he's
undefeated
on TV?
at heavyweight? I do think there is some of that. I think that it's good that he went away from Fox a little bit, building up to this fight. Like, I think that there might be a little bit too much of him out there, and people long for what they don't have and don't see. But, like, look at his record at heavyweight. He was going to be a heavyweight champion, and he only went down because of Cain Velasquez. And look at his record at light heavyweight. Look who he's defeated at light heavyweight. He has one loss on his record, and it's to the greatest of all time, arguably. How is he not the pound-for-pound best? I don't need to get into all this stuff, but how is Demetrius Johnson above him? I'm sorry.
It is a weird thing when you think about it.
But Cormier is undefeated at the weight class above. Isn't that exactly what pound-for-pound is all about?
It's not like he's just wrestled. Like, I think when he was coming up, people were like, oh, he's a wrestler, but he's shown he can do so much more than just wrestle. I don't know. That's a really good question.
You've been talking to Malky Kawa or something?
No, he doesn't represent Cormier.
No, I'm saying, like, getting all this bad stuff about Cormier. Like John's manager. I'm saying it's...
Oh, no, and anytime I write about Cormier, I get, Cormier, stop talking about it.
Boy, people just give you negative feedback about everyone.
All the time. I guess it's the John Jones AstroTurfers. He's paying to talk about Daniel Cormier. I don't know. I'm excited, and also, it's the UFC's return to the great city of Buffalo, home of the champions.
We'll get to World Series of Fighting next week.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about World Series of Fighting, but there's not much to add there. They claim Justin Gaethje's not a free agent. We say otherwise. I guess we're about to find out, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. That's all for today. We are off next week, as I said. We're back in 2 weeks. So it's a relatively quiet weekend, as we mentioned, in the world of MMA, but there is Bellator. I was told that Emmanuel Sanchez missed weight, but they are still going to keep that fight on, yeah, unfortunately. But the headline, of course, is Rampage versus King Mo 2, last fight on Rampage's current Bellator contract. And there's Cage Warriors coming back on Saturday. Paddy Pimblett is competing in Liverpool. That's on
Chuck's favorite.
Yeah, Fight Pass. Paddy the Batty. He's great. He's a lot of fun. All right, we are done for Luke, Chuck, Jeff. I am Ariel. Again, thanks for watching this week. See you in 2 weeks, and enjoy the fights.